I wanted to do this workshop tonight, mostly like a quick chat, if you will, where we're just going to chat about what makes for an interesting SOP, especially in context of what makes for a non-interesting one when you compare it to what makes for a non-interesting SOP. Now, a lot of you guys are going through the CAPID process now. Maybe some of you have already submitted your application, and if you have, great. I mean, that's congrats to that. Congrats to you for doing that. You know, this topic came to me a few weeks ago, and it wasn't that I was strategically trying to make a topic like this after CAPID opened. I would probably like to have this early on, but I just had to put it out there because I've been reading a lot of SOPs recently, even new ones that come across our door. As maybe some of you guys know, we do have a service that provides help with your SOP. It's called editing.internationaldentistcentral.com. It's the website. I'll put it in the chat box. As I am involved in looking at a lot of SOPs, I take a look at that stuff and I say, yeah, this is really interesting, this is really compelling, or it's not. And so what typically happens is people come to us and they'll basically say, you know, I didn't get in last year. I don't know what happened. I'm trying to figure that out. And this is when often we'll hear from them. We'll have them show up at our door, if you will, our digital door, and ask for some help. And this is when I read the SOP and I say, I see the problem. I see why maybe a school didn't reach out to you this year, or last year, I should say. And then we'll work on some improvements to see if we can help that candidate make a better case for themselves. And so the principles I'm going to be teaching are they're interesting because they're fairly historic. They're fairly foundational to all of human civilization. So if you understand how humans are built, and if you understand how humans have evolved as a civilization, you'll understand then why maybe your SOP is not having the impact it has in its current form. So my hope for you tonight is to help you understand why it's so important. Where do these things come from? These techniques that are as old as time. And how can I take advantage of that? How can I leverage these to make more interesting documents? So whether you've done your SOP and you've submitted it or not, and now you're just working on your supplemental questions, that's great too. You can use some of these techniques for that. Or whether you have already submitted everything and now you're hoping to get an interview. Well, guess what? You can use these techniques that I'm going to talk about for an SOP for your interview. So it doesn't matter where you are in this process. If you haven't even submitted your CAPID application, great. You know, maybe I'm reaching you before you're going to submit. And if you're even at the place where you're not even applying this year, still great. It doesn't really matter where you are, as long as you haven't gotten accepted. There's something in for you in this workshop for you tonight. I promise you that. There is something that you will walk away feeling like, oh, a bit of something clicked for you, I hope. And if not, then I'm not doing my job well enough. But my hope is that at least something you'll be able to walk away with, taking away something that you'll find valuable. So I hope that you guys will stay tuned. I'm going to throw up a few my screen so we can look at some pictures and stuff. Because what I've found over the years is that when I've done workshops and I've done presentations, if I ever make, and I've made the mistake many times, but if I make the mistake of including too much text, people not that interested. People drop out. But if I am wise enough to just include pictures and bring you into a story, people like to stay. People are more interested. And so that's my goal tonight, is to not just be hypocritical and say, well, do what I say, but don't do what I do. But I've tried to make my presentation a little more enticing and compelling, so that I'm also teaching you through showing you what I want you to do in your SOP or any document you're writing. So let me just kind of show you. Let me switch my screen over real quick. I'm going to see if you can see that. It's probably a little small though. I'll see if I can make it a little larger. There's a better way. Why is my SOP boring? Topic of the night. Now, you might say, how dare you? My SOP is not boring. Well, I'm not speaking to everyone, so if your SOP is not boring, stamp of approval, then this may not be for you. But if you're wondering, could it be that it's not as enticing as I think, or as I think, then stay tuned, because this will be interesting. Typically we find our story, our own personal chronological story from where we started when we were children to now. We find it the most interesting of stories, right? It's all a story. Everyone's life is basically a story. If there's no story, imagine you just take out the narrative of your own story. Well, who are you? I mean, I don't want to get too deep here, but like, the story is who we are in many ways. And guess who finds our story most exciting, most interesting? Whether it's a good story that's full of fun and laughter and joy, or a story that's filled with pain and sadness and sorrow, we still find our own story the most interesting. And that's important to keep in mind, because we can take for granted the fact that everyone else must find our story just as interesting as we do. And the opposite is true. Most people find it completely boring. Most people are completely uninterested in our story. And when we write it out on a piece of paper, or print it out on a piece of paper and submit it as a statement of purpose or a personal statement, we see that that's true. Most people don't care. And so sometimes people are invited to interviews despite a good SOP. Some people are invited to interviews despite having a really boring SOP. So they'll forgive you for that, but that's not because of your SOP that you were invited. And then other people will have great profiles and be really impressive with their CV and their experiences and stuff like that. And yet they won't be invited. And a lot of times the difference could have been an SOP or other documents. I'm Kevin Marshall. I've been doing interview specialization with IDC for, 7 or 8 years. And I come from, again, the academic side. I actually worked also at a few in the world of information technology for a while. I was at a top 100, Fortune 100 company, which is, I was in the aerospace industry. But before that, I spent 6 years as a staff member at a university in California. I was on academic program admission, so similar to who I mentioned, Kara. I was the one who had to make decisions about which students would be accepted into various programs at different levels. I was on tons of interview selection committees all across the university, from people that were my colleagues to people who were way above me, like the president of the university, all the way to various graduate students and all types of students. So thousands of interviews, I will say, is what I just remember doing. Lots and lots of interviews, including group processes similar to the USC group process, including spending weekends and nights, late nights, going through hundreds stacks of of applications, not dissimilar to what CAPID is like, and having to make difficult decisions and being in meetings to make difficult decisions about who we would take on and who we would not. So that's my background. My partner, Dr. Alyssa, she's the one who went through the advanced studying program as a dentist. So her and I partnered together. We had different strengths, and I had lots of experience in the interview and documentation side, and she had lots of experience on the dental, of course, the dental side, like bench test, ideal preps, and all that kind of stuff. So together we worked together and created IDC. So that's a little story about us. If we haven't told you that story, I want to get right though into something that I think is very important, which is stories, stories, stories. And so this is where I think people really mess up. This is where people fail to really get how important a story is when they're writing their SOP or when they're writing even other documents. Now, CV and experiences, this is not applied to that. So don't run away that you have put tons of stories in your CV. This is CV is one exception to this, but almost all the other documents and responses, various responses, will need some good stories. Case by case, there are some exceptions, but let's just focus on the SOP though. The SOP is effectively a story. I want you to think about the ancient stories of human civilization. What are these ancient stories? And they're all around the world. There's lots of them. You can have ancient Egyptian stories of Ra, and all the different kind of mythologies you hear in that culture. Here we have Hercules. It's an ancient Greek story. I don't know why Disney made him with blue eyes and almost blondish hair. I think he was Greek, so he should have been dark hair, but but that's besides the point. You have Krishna and Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, an ancient story that many of us know. We have Mulan. And this is Mulan. Yes, it's been Disneyfied, but it's also an ancient story from China about a warrior princess, I believe. And so these are the stories that all of our cultures have again, these go back thousands of years. So these are the stories that we keep telling over and over again. We keep bringing them back. We keep making movies about them. They go round and round. And why? What is it about these stories that make us so interested? Yes, of course, there's some religious aspects or there's some spiritual aspects, so there's that to it. But they're just, even if you took those away, all three of these stories, for instance, if you take even any of the religious aspects away, it's just a darn good story. All of them are just darn good stories. So I have a quote here from a famous ancient philosopher from Rome named Epictetus. And I like it because it really shows what makes a good story. And the quote goes, what would have become of Hercules do you think if there had not been a lion, a hydra, a stag, or a boar, basically his enemies, and no savage criminals to rid the world of? What would he have done in the absence of such challenges? Obviously, he would have just rolled over in bed and gone back to sleep. And guess what? We would have never heard of Hercules, right? There would have never been a story about Hercules that was of any interest retelling if there had been no challenges, if there had been no lion, if there had been no enemy named the Hydra or Stag. In all of these stories, if Mulan didn't have an enemy that she was fighting in the battlefield, there would be no story there. There'd be nothing to talk about. She would just be another person, cooking and cleaning and living the rest of the stuff that we all do in life. Going to work, whatever. There would have been nothing if there's nothing to overcome, there's nothing to bother talking about. And this is so important because these were great challenges in all of these stories that we see here. Each one of these heroes, and I'm going to call them hero for a moment, had to face great challenges. And in each story, there's usually a few different components. There are aspects of ups and downs, where you're feeling great, where you're feeling depressed and hopeless, where you almost lose it. You almost lose the win. You almost don't complete your mission. And there's aspects of guides and advisors coming in to help you. You can see Krishna here helping Arjuna, guiding him through his journeys. You can see and I don't have the pictures here, but in both the Hercules and the Mulan story, there's guides that come to help them through the difficult times and give them support and give them hope. Now, who are these people in your story? And that's what I want to get to today. I want to talk about the hero's journey, because I want you to start thinking before you start writing your SOP, or if you've written it and you're going to work on another document, or if you've submitted everything and you're going to go to an interview, I still want you to think about yourself as the hero, because you're going to have to be in an interview. And who's the hero here? Well, if there's no hero, there's no story. And if there's no story, boring. There's no bother talking about anything if there's no hero. And now we don't usually refer to ourselves as the hero. That would be a bad idea in an SOP. And we certainly don't want to say that we're a hero in the interview. But we want to basically talk about ourselves in such a way that indicates that there is some heroic things that happen to us. So who's your dragon? Or I don't know what this kind of beast is, but who's your dragon? And what were the dragon? And I shouldn't say who's your dragon, because we don't want to be personal and say, oh, this terrible person hurt me, and I don't want to go there. But I do want to talk about the challenges that you faced in life. That should be your dragon. And so I want you to start reflecting on that. Here's a little graph. It's not great in terms of the resolution, so I apologize if it's hard to read, but I'll walk you through it. We have our hero here, and this is sort of what we call the hero's journey. This is important because this is sort of like the cookie cut formula to what makes an interesting story from the beginning of time. So whether we're talking about ancient, Greece and Egypt, ancient China, ancient India, whatever we're talking about, these stories, we'll often find similar patterns in these stories, that what makes them last the length of time and withstand time, is that they have these patterns in them. And if we can figure out what those patterns are and reverse engineer it, we can help to improve our story and figure out what are the elements that we have in our story that need to be expressed. So first of all, we have a call to adventure. This is something where maybe the hero is just sitting around one day and they're enjoying their great life. Everything's going wonderful, but they are called to adventure. Now, why am I using that word adventure? Because it's not just I got a call to go do my duty. It's not just called to go work. It's a positive call. It's a call for something more exciting than what you already have. If you've ever watched the story of Luke Skywalker, you know that at the beginning, he's helping his uncle on this planet. He's kind of a lonely kid. And I can't remember exactly how it goes, but eventually he meets somebody who calls him, I think Obi-Wan Kenobi, calls him to adventure, calls him to come and fight this big space battle, right? That wasn't what he was doing before. He was just sitting at home working and living a pretty boring life. So you're called to adventure. Now, what is it for you as you think about your story? Well, let's think of one thing that many of you have, which is that in some ways, many of you were called to make a big journey across the oceans, often to the US, let's say, or to Canada. So that's the calling. Something called you to make that big decision, right? But it wasn't easy. And you get to the crossing the threshold. There's usually some kind of point in the story where you have to make that threshold. You have to cross that, say, am I going to do it or am I not going to do it? Am I going to say yes to that adventure, or am I going to sit back and just live in my more comfortable life? And this is really important in an SOP with regard to dentistry, because I talk about this often with folks. If you were called to adventure by sort of like, because there were no other options, maybe your family brought you here, your parents, they say, we're moving here, whether you like it or not. Well, that's not that adventurous anymore, right? I mean, you haven't made that cross, you haven't crossed the threshold yet. Now, maybe at one point you say, well, I'm going to stay home. I'm not coming with you, mom and dad. Well, then you decide to. The moment you decide to is when you cross the threshold. You say, okay, yes, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to take the adventure with you. But if you're forced to do it, it's not so much an exciting adventure anymore. And that's why I really encourage you, when you're thinking about your SOP, to make sure that you are the hero in your own journey. You're the person who decided to cross this threshold, because this shows that you have character. This shows that you are a hero. You're someone who's willing to risk the comfortability of your previous life for something more exciting and more adventurous. So what is that for you? And when was that moment? When was that turning point where you said, yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to cross this. Now, it doesn't just have to be coming to North America, by the way. There's other ways you could have been called to adventure. You could have been called to adventure by entering dental school in the first place, and the odds may have been against you. Maybe you were in a town where there were no doctors or dentists, a small rural village or something like that. Maybe you were a female and nobody's thought females should be doing that kind of study. Maybe, whatever. Maybe you wanted to do a specialty, and so after your dental degree, you go on, and people say, "Don't do that. It's a waste of time," or "You'll be fine. Don't. It's too hard," and you decide, "Yes, I'm going to cross that threshold." So you have to think about what those points are for you. Then you're going to go into the road of trials, which is basically things are freaking hard, right? Things are not easy. And this is the point where you are maybe in dental school and you're struggling through classes and you're struggling to catch up with things and you're to get this stuff. Things are not easy. And now this is the part where people don't want to talk about in their SOP. And this is what I see a lot is, oh, shouldn't I just write how wonderful everything was? Isn't that what they want to hear, Kevin? Shouldn't I just be positive only and talk about how I was amazing at dental school and everything came super easy to me? Well, can you imagine how exciting of a story that would be if you went to the movie? And we're going to get into an example in a minute about that. But think of how boring of a story that would be to read. Well, this person, they made a decision. It was not hard to make that decision to go to the adventure. Once they kind of like crossed the threshold, everything came to them super easy. Every test they took, they got a straight A. Every time they went into the dental clinic, they knew how to do everything. Well, that's not a very interesting story. There's no problems. There's no trials. And again, we go back to some of our heroes here. Without the Hydra, without the lion, without these savage criminals, there's no point in talking about Hercules. He would just be a big guy. So same idea. There has to be some problems that you encounter. And this is the biggest problem I see in SOPs that I read, that come to me. There's no problems in there because everyone's so scared to mention any problems. They have them. All of us have had issues. All of us have had challenges through our journey. But if we're not willing to admit them because we don't want to look bad and we don't want to take any risk at all, well, guess what? We're going to have a pretty flat story, a pretty flat looking SOP that's very unmemorable. And this is my main point is we want to think of ourselves as heroes. Okay, well, a hero has to have, an enemy, a villain, right? We have to have a villain. It doesn't have to be a person, but it has to be there. Then there's this abyss. This is the abyss where things are feeling pretty darn hopeless. This is the bottom of our stories. We're at rock bottom. Things don't look good. We made a bad decision. Maybe we shouldn't have become a dentist or gone to dental school. I thought this would be easy when I came to the U.S. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. I'm challenged in every way. I remember having a candidate that I worked with. And here's a good story, right? This is a story that I remember 7 years later after meeting him. I only heard the story once from him during when we worked on his SOP. But I remember it 7 years later. It sticks in my mind. I'll never forget it. He came to the U.S. with his family. He decided to come from Egypt to the U.S. to New York. His family, his brother, I think, and his father, were working. Everything was great. He was starting to study for the maybe part 1 or MBD. And suddenly his father has a heart attack. And he's suddenly not able to work anymore. Now there's no money coming into the family. And they're all like freaking out. He has to go get a job at 7-Eleven to just pay the rent and to support his family in five or so people in this teeny little apartment in New York. He's going to 7-Eleven every day, working long hours while studying for the boards. And one night, while he's sitting there at 7-Eleven with his book open, studying dental concepts and medical concepts, someone comes up to him and robs him at gunpoint, brings up a gun, and says, "Give me all your money." And he's freaking out, and he gives him the money, and he lives. He lives another day, and everything's okay. But how close he came. This was sort of his abyss. This is the bottom of his father just had a heart attack. He doesn't know if they're going to be able to pay the rent. He doesn't know the future. He was going to be, he was likely to have the time and money and energy to study, and now he has to work full time. Things are looking pretty bad for him. But he keeps pushing forward, and he gets a job at a local community college teaching dental assistants, and suddenly that brings him some more money, and now he's actually practicing dentistry a little bit, and now and things are good, looking up for him, and slowly he gets out of it, passes all his boards, and he builds himself back up to the point where he's ready to apply. And that's the SOP, right? That's a darn good story, right? It's a story that all of us hopefully will, well, I don't know if you'll remember it, but when I heard that story and read that story, and we talked about what to, we kind of talked about it, we put it into the SOP. That was a story that he got tons of interviews, I will say. He went from having very few interviews the year before to having, I don't know, 4 or 5 times the interviews he got. And he got acceptances at multiple places, and he was not the most perfect candidate. Isn't that interesting? He wasn't the candidate with the highest GPA. He wasn't the candidate with the most experience in his home country. And yet he got multiple acceptances that year because he brought it. He brought that story, and they cared, and it was a story that people felt something about when they read his story, and they wanted to give him a chance. People overlook this all the time. They think it's just about stats. But it's not just about stats. It's also about, who are you? Are you painting yourself as the hero who should be given a chance, who they respect and want to be a part of your exciting story and your adventure? Or are you just, no, everything's been great, no problems, and they don't really care at the end of the day? So that's what I mean with this story stuff. Again, we go through the abyss, the bottom of it, the metamorphosis, he starts to change, or that person starts to change, the ultimate boon, and then the boon would be sort of the biggest obstacle again that you're going to fight. It's sort of like the plot. What is it called in a movie script, where it's sort of like the big fight, and then I think it's returning the boon. Is that right? Ultimate boon, the returning the boon. I'll have to look this up later, but this is basically, there's this big plot point at the end where you kind of fight the biggest fight against your villain, and you win. And that's everyone, hooray, we celebrate, we're excited. Again, I go to Star Wars, you fight the Empire or whatever, and you shoot them down, everything's great, explosions. And that's a great story. So that's typically what Hollywood does. That's typically and Hollywood didn't create this. This is from every ancient book of humanity uses this technique. Go to any mythology, it's going to have a lot of this stuff in there. Not everything, but a lot of it. And so that's what we want to paint into our stories. Now, what do I see instead? But let's get into, actually, before I get there, I want to kind of use an example. Let's use Jason Bourne, just to kind of paint this for you. Jason Bourne, I don't know if you've seen these movies. You have Matt Damon here as Jason Bourne. He's supposed to be a spy, right? But imagine you go to see Jason Bourne. I don't know. I haven't seen one of those movies for 10, 15 years. But I remember the first one vaguely. So let's say, though, you go into the movies, it's great, you should go see Jason Bourne, A Bourne Identity. All right, starts out, he's just a guy, Matt Damon, and then he's a young kid. He goes to college, and guess what? He graduates college. That's great. Everyone's happy about it. You're watching the movie, and then the next scene, he gets his dream job. Oh, great. How wonderful. How nice. He's working. Things are looking up for him. Things are doing pretty good. And then guess what? The next scene, he gets a family. He gets married, and now he's got a family. He's going to the park, having great fancy meals with his maybe spouse, or maybe he's like going and playing, going to the amusement park with his kids. The next scene, money, he gets a raise. Things are doing great. He's got more money. Everything's great. Look at, checks his app, his bank accounts, tons of money in there. He loves it. And then boom, the end. That's the end of the story. Wasn't that a great movie? Well, no, that's not a great movie. Everyone who went to see that movie would be bored out of their minds, right? We all know that nobody's going to like that movie because there's no excitement in this story. This is just pretty much there's no drama. There's a lot of ups, but there's no downs. There's no challenges. There's no villains. There's nothing. So who's gonna actually watch this story again? Who's gonna go and pay and tell your friends to go? Yeah, pay $20 to see this movie where basically nothing happens interesting. No one's gonna see that. What do we have in the real movie? This is just what I pulled down from the plot, so excuse me. But basically, the plot, as it's written, is it's been 10 years since Jason Bourne walked away from the agency that trained him to become a deadly weapon. Hoping to draw him out of the shadows, CIA Director Robert Dewey assigns hacker and counterinsurgency expert Heather Lee to find him. As she begins tracking the duo, Bourne finds himself back in the action, battling a sinister network that utilizes terror and technology to maintain unchecked power. So that's one. I don't even know if this is the main Bourne Identity movie, but I know one thing. I vaguely remember a scene where he wakes up and he doesn't know who he is, right? So that's one of the common plot themes of the Bourne Identities. He never knows who he is, which is very frustrating, right? You don't know who you are, and yet you're supposed to be. You have these superhero like abilities and skills, and you don't know why, but you can beat people up and fight enemies. How interesting, how strange, how not all this. The movie has nothing to do with everything going right for him. If anything, he's depressed. He doesn't know who he is. He's confused. But what does he do? He wins at the end of the day. He gets people that help him and give him guidance and support, and he starts to figure out more and more who he is. And that's a good story, right? So that's what I want you to think about is, what do we have in most of our SOPs these days? What we have is this. Everything looks great. And this is why I put Jason Bourne submits a typical SOP to the CAPIT, right? So a lot of candidates, I'd say 70-80% of candidates are writing their SOP like this. Everything was wonderful. I just became a dentist. Everything went easy, smooth for me. Then I got, my dream job working as a dental associate in my home country. I got married, maybe. Maybe they don't say the money part, but everything else was good. Things were fine. I did this particular research project. I gave this particular presentation. I, did this treatment. Everything worked there. No problems. Everything great. Then I came to the U.S. I'm very happy about that. Got a great job as a dental assistant. And here I am. There's nothing technically wrong there, except that if everyone is doing that, if 70 or 80%, and I guarantee you that's about what it is, because I read them all. I read probably a pretty good snapshot. I probably have I could have a good sample size of SOPs, because many people ask us to help, or at least to read through them for feedback. And so I can say that if everyone's doing this, if 7 out of 10 candidates is writing their SOP in this fashion, where all they're doing is stuffing facts from their backgrounds in this, then what's likely to be is that if you're one of those people in the 7 out of 10, you're going to be measured up against those other 7 people. It's going to be very difficult to stand out, and no one's going to remember you except for if your stats are mind-blowing. Then they'll remember you, because they're like, wow, this is great. I don't even know what the SOP was about, but I love these stats. Let's go for it. So that's what but if you don't have those incredible stats that are incredible and perfect and all that stuff, then you have to figure out other ways of differentiation. And that's why you want to have the SOP. So I brought you to this. I hope by this point, I've at least convinced you how important an SOP, let's see if I can do that. I hope I've convinced you how important an SOP is and how important the story is in an SOP. Because that's my main goal. And this is not supposed to be, I'm not going to go, I typically can go longer than an hour. This is going to be more of a short one. I'll take some questions in a few minutes. But what I want to leave you with is, I gave you that kind of recipe of the hero's journey. You can look that up. It's easy to find. Just type in hero's journey in Google. You're going to get a lot of diagrams, and you can use that to think about. Because again, the hero's journey has that call to an adventure. Then I didn't even mention the other part about the guides. There's often a guide in a hero's journey story. Again, we talk about Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, or we talk about Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars with Luke, right? He's that guide that says, or Yoda, hey, you're down in the dumps. You don't think you can make it. Let me help you. I believe in Greek mythology, Zeus is sometimes that guy. He's the god of, sort of like the top god or whatever there. And so, and he, I think Hercules was half god, half human or something. And so there's something, maybe it was one of his godparents or something like that. But there's always this guide, often this guide, I should say, who helps the hero figure stuff out. And that's important too. So what is that? How does that relate? Well, who are your guides in your story? Who in your story are your guides? Was it a professor? Was it a teacher in high school that said, I believe in you? You can do it. You have what it takes. Even though your family didn't believe in you or they didn't care, somebody believed in you, and they are saying, you're going to make it. You're going to be special. or it's even somebody you're working with now. It could be somebody like a dentist that you're working with as a dental assistant. So find those guides in your story, those inspirational characters. And by talking about them in your story, you may not think it's important, but talking about them, I would much rather you spend time talking about a guide for 3 or 4 sentences than just stuffing those 3 or 4 sentences with more facts from your CV. Because that's what most people do. Again, they grab their CV. Oh, okay, let's grab a bunch of facts, blah, 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 throw it in the SOP, and now we got a story. No, you don't. You just got basically a CV written out in long form. So finding those guides, of course, we have to be careful not to overdo it with that. We don't want to write like full paragraphs about the guide, especially if there's little discussion about what they did for you. So again, I might, if I'm going to spend precious real estate in an SOP and I want to talk about my guide, I might give them a few sentences, but then I want to really spend time. What did they teach me? What interactions did I have with them? What did they tell me to improve? And then what was the result of their advice? How did I take that and take it up a notch? So those are some of the things that I want you to think about. The villain, right? So there's another character piece in the story. Let's think you're writing a script or something for a movie. Who's the villain? Every movie has to have a good villain or something, right? Who's the villain in your story? And I keep saying who, but what is the villain is a better way of saying that. What is the villain? I don't want you necessarily, as I said earlier, I don't want you necessarily coming up with a particular person who is a villain, but I would like you to think about personal challenges, if you're willing to talk about it. Like I mentioned in the story of the candidate that I worked with, his villain could have been the guy who held him at gunpoint. His villain could have been his father's health. So personal issues like that, if you're willing to talk about those things. And if you're willing to get a little vulnerable, well, the story can come to life. It doesn't mean that I say be vulnerable for no good reason, but that's what helps us as a reader relate to the hero. I can relate to you now because you talked about struggles you've gone through. But if everything was perfect and easy for you, I can't relate to that. So who are the villain? What is the villain for you? You could talk about, I had a candidate, of course, I'm using more extreme examples, so they're easy to think about. But, I've had candidates that have survived and gone through war zones and gone to work. I remember a particular candidate who walked to work every day while there were bombs, in the distance going off. Well, that's pretty dramatic, right? But that's the villain there, right? And so that would be one. But it doesn't have to be so dramatic. It can be simple as seeing, maybe I'm trying to think of something like much more common that's still important. I would say, again, like a family issue, a health issue that you're willing to talk about can be that. It can be that you didn't have the tutoring that maybe some of your classmates were given. Maybe you went to a university where everyone was sort of from a privileged background and you were like more of a working class or working class background, and you didn't have the tutoring offered to them all the time. So when you got a A on a test, it was after toiling and striving and fighting for that, because you didn't just get it. You would go to class and not understand what they were saying, but then you would work 3 times as hard after class, working with a professor or working with a tutor or finding help from a study group, while the other folks that you knew just came easy to them. So that could be the villain, is just how hard it was for you. Maybe you did get an F, and there's times where I've seen this work where someone fails a class and they talk about it because it's there anyway, right? So they're going to see the F in the transcript, but then they make more of a story like this was a turning point for me, and after that I never allowed that to happen again. I just didn't I didn't realize what I was in for before, and then once I did, I knew how to study. It taught me how to study. It taught me this, it taught me that. So you can use that lemon and turn it into a lemonade, right? So there's different ways of talking about the villain, if you will, in your story. But it's really important to identify that. If you don't have a villain and you're not really talking about it, the story's going to be flat, not going to be interesting. Now, I say all this, and there's people who are like, ooh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to take that risk. I don't want to talk about something that was bad because maybe they'll look down on me and they'll think, oh, I don't, that person had a family health issue. I don't want to get near that. I don't know. I don't like that. Well, it's possible that the reader could think that, but it's also possible the reader could have the opposite reaction and say, wow, this is refreshing. This person's being honest and open, and they're just saying what happened. They're not being a dramatic person. They're not asking for sympathy, but they're being honest, and they're talking about what really happened to them in a sincere and honest way, and they're being transparent. And everybody has problems, so why should I count that against them? That's great. Let's go with this. Let's give them a chance. And so that's what I would say is think about some of the ways that you can be more vulnerable and honest in your SOP, and take that risk. Doesn't mean take the full risk. I'm not trying to say, I did a treatment on a patient and they lost their sensation in their jaw or on their face or whatever for the rest of their life. That's not what I'm not talking about admitting to things that if they heard, they would likely say no to you. I'm not trying to suggest that you take those kind of risks. Those are probably unwise to talk about stuff like that if you've made major mistakes in your career. I'm not talking about those risks. I'm talking about taking the risk of being vulnerable and talking about that, yes, I'm human, I have problems. So hopefully that's been helpful to you. I kind of just want to get that out as people are still applying. This is still open. We're still somewhat early in CAPA. There's a 3-month window. We're only a month or so has gone by, a month and 7 days. So there's still some time for those of you who are still applying. And I wanted to get this out there to the community before everybody is submitted. And then if you have submitted, don't worry about it. Be happy with what you got. Be happy with what you put out there. It's not about regret. But now you can take hopefully some of this and apply it in the interview. And think about yourself in that same way for the interview. How can you tell stories in your interview that subtly, but importantly, highlight you as someone who overcomes, someone who has had challenges and overcomes them?